Hello, I'm Timothy Nishimoto from Pink Martini, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Today, we'll be talking about Texas and California, two of our most populous states that could not be more different. Joining us are Katherine O'Rourke and Ben Koush, authors of Home, Heat, Money, God, Texas, and Modern Architecture. And we'll also talk with Michael Webb, author of California Houses, Creativity in Context. And now here's your host, born in North Carolina, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Texas is a land of cowboys, real and pretend. Oil wells, rugged individualism, God, country music, and unwavering loyalty to the Dallas Cowboys. California is a land of movie stars, real and pretend, sunshine, gurus, yoga pants, avocado toast, way too much plastic surgery, and $20 organic smoothies. I like both states, although I can tell you nothing is hotter than a Texas summer. And as Mark Twain said, nothing is colder than a summer in San Francisco. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Katherine O'Rourke is an architectural historian and a professor of art history at Trinity University.
Go Tigers!
She has written several books, including Modern Architecture in Mexico City and O'Neill Ford on Architecture. Ben Koush is an architect who has written for many publications, including Architect's Newspaper. He's driven thousands of miles across Texas to photograph and document modern design. The photos are for their new book on Texas modernism. It's called Home, Heat, Money, God, Texas and Modern Architecture. Here's George's conversation with Katherine and Ben.
Back in the 80s, we all watched Dallas. And something I realized recently is that when you look at the opening scene of Dallas, there's some modern architecture in there before they get to South Fork. Was that kind of a boom time for architecture in the 80s, along with oil and Dallas and Larry Hagman?
Yes, because there was so much money flowing through Texas, of course, with the oil industry, until there wasn't. And then there was a crash that we certainly saw a lot of in Houston. But that opening sequence in Dallas, we loved because it seemed like it captured so much about both the image of the state as it was broadcast out to the country, to the world through Dallas, with those amazing gold mirrored buildings, which are so wild and seem so iconic and talk about money and wealth and a kind of excess, right, that we might associate with Dallas. And then also with those cows running across the plain. So we grabbed that, and that was one of a kind of foundational image, at least in my thinking. And of course, it's not Ben's image, but we're thinking about what we were doing with this book.
I just like the fact that they were showing examples of modern architecture designed by architects on this TV show and featuring it pretty prominently. So it was nice to see how deeply modern architecture had penetrated into the culture of Texas at that time.
I wasn't clear in looking at the book, kind of the chicken or the egg part of here. So, Ben, did you have the idea for the book and you got Katherine on board, or did Katherine have the idea for the book and get Ben on board? How did that work?
It was my idea to start doing it. I had been sort of documenting architecture through photography for a while, and during the pandemic, I had a lot of free time, so I started organizing all my pictures, and I suddenly realized how many I actually had, which was way more than I thought. And so I was posting them also on Instagram, and people kept saying, "Where's the book? Where's the book? Where's the book?" And then I was like, "Well, you know what? Maybe now is some time I'll start thinking about doing a book." And I got in touch with the people at the UT Press. And they were interested in it, and they liked the photos, but they wanted something more than Instagram commentary. So I knew Katherine from our time on the State Board Review at the Texas Historic Commission, and admire her writing very much. And I asked her if she'd be interested, and we weren't sure, but she said yes. And so it took off from there.
And one of the things I love about the book, besides what's in it, is the fact that it's a really cool size. It's the kind of size that says, hey, read me, versus big format books which say, flip through me. How did you decide on the size?
So we wanted people to be able to hold it, right? To enjoy that feeling, make it easy to read, maybe even read a little bit of it in bed, but also be big enough so that you see those beautiful photographs really well.
Yeah. And part of it was also guided by the fact that most of the images were taken with an iPhone, so they're not humongous files. And the graphic designer was a little bit anxious about having humongous pages. But we like the idea. I mean, I'm so used to looking at my phone. I like the idea of a smaller book. Like when I buy books now, if I see a big coffee table book, I usually leave it alone. And this size, I think, is really nice. And the graphic designer pointed out that even though it's not the biggest book, if you have a pile of books on your coffee table, it'll be the one on top.
How many miles did you log, Ben, to do research for this book?
You know, it was over such a long period of time that I don't know, and I probably don't really want to have to try to calculate it. It'd be a little bit too depressing. Think about how much time I spent in the car and flying and all these things to go to these different places.
Well, the name of the book is Home, Heat, Money, God, and it's about modern architecture. But with that title, I mean, it can really be about anything in Texas, right? Those are the main themes of Texas.
So the book is organized thematically, as you know. Each chapter has a different theme, and the first 4 chapters are home, heat, money, and God. And one of the great challenges for me in this project, one of the things that was exciting to me about it, was having all these beautiful photographs. And Ben was very generous in saying, here, you pick. Here they are. And getting to select from just thousands and thousands of images that he had taken and figuring out how to tell a story with them, a story about Texas and about modern architecture. And the themes, to me, were very suggestive. I didn't want to write a chronology. I didn't want to write a guidebook. I didn't think those would be fun or interesting or maybe even appropriate to our time. And that these themes might allow us to talk about, of course, these buildings and architects, but also these broader issues, exactly as you say, that seem to be particular to the state of Texas.
I defer to Katherine on the thematic organization. I put on my good client hat and I said, Katherine, whatever you think the best way to organize the images and make the narrative for the story is what I want to do also.
How did modernism take a hold in Texas? I'm familiar with just a few houses, like the Neutra House in Brownsville is a famous one, but that seemed to be kind of a one-off for the time. So how did modernism seep its way into what we think of as conservative Texas?
Well, in some ways, the story is very similar to the spread of modern architecture around the world in the 1930s, right? As what was happening in avant-garde circles in Europe begins to be published in architecture journals, as architects have to flee particularly from Germany with the rise of fascism, and as photographs, interestingly, of course, of great modern buildings just get published farther and farther. And then, of course, when Gropius comes to Harvard and starts teaching at the GSD, that's a huge transformation, at the beginning of a transformation in architectural education in the United States. So in that sense, I think that there are some very strong similarities with what we see in other non-Western European places. But one of the things that I was really interested in is the way that clients in Texas embrace modernism to such a dramatic degree early on. And this, of course, increases in the period that a book covers. We start in the 1930s and go through to the 1980s. But that they seem to see it as a way of signifying, of course, ambition and newness and modernity and a kind of presence within this cosmopolitan world. And you see that particularly in cities like Houston, where there's this very deep consciousness of wanting to be part of all of the great stuff that's happening beyond the borders of Texas. So there's a kind of boldness, right? The boldness that we sometimes think about with modernism that I think a lot of clients liked. But of course, it has many iterations, right? And many variations. And that's part of what comes out with these themes.
I know Texas likes to be big. Did they want to be the biggest in optimism for the future?
I think it certainly is about projecting optimism, confidence, right? It is a reflection, too, of the changing status of the state in this period with the oil boom, with the ascendance of Texas in national politics, with figures, of course, like Lyndon Johnson, that it really does become a more important place than it had been before. And that's very interesting when you think about the history of architecture, that so often, right, great buildings and these sort of great stories of patronage, of course, follow money. And that's what we see here. I think the story is particularly fascinating because it's so tied up with all kinds of social issues and problems and challenges. And we talk about that in the book, right, with respect to segregation and civil rights and also to environmental issues as they're already starting to rise to the surface in the 1960s.
So let's talk about heat. How does Texas deal with the heat and its houses, for instance?
I mean, before air conditioning and after air conditioning are two humongous divides, I guess. And before that, it was passive cooling, and they would take cues from things from the 19th century, like big windows. And instead of like a big, tall, narrow Victorian window, they'd have sliding glass doors with screens to keep bugs out, overhangs on the roofs, solar shading devices, which as an architect, I particularly like because I think they're very fascinating as a way to articulate a building. And after air conditioning and better things like improved solar glass, like glass that can keep heat out with tinting or treatments on it to keep UV light out and keep heat out the building, then you didn't really need to do that quite so much. So then you get stuff like the mirror glass, like on the Campbell Centre building in Dallas. And that is a different way of dealing with the heat, and it produces really iconic buildings. So it's interesting to see the way the buildings were changing from the 1930s and 40s before air conditioning, especially in houses. They didn't really start doing that until after World War II. And then seeing how they got more compact, I guess, and more surface area exposed to the sun, but you could deal with it because of the better mechanical systems.
I remember spending a week in Dallas one time, and I thought I was just going to bake well done. I mean, it gets up there to the hundreds, 110s now.
Increasingly.
It's all over the state, not just Dallas.
Yeah.
Is it East Texas or West Texas that gets even more hot at different times of year?
We have different problems depending on where you are. In West Texas, it's that dry desert heat. And then East Texas and the Gulf Coast, it's horribly humid, which is awful in a different way.
Yes.
So, yeah. And, that's an interesting point to kind of go back to your other question, right? The ascendance of air conditioning is so much a part of the story of these buildings. And we talk about that a lot. And the irony, right? And we're starting to think about this, I think, collectively more and more, is that you have all this air conditioning that, of course, makes us inside cooler, but makes the earth hotter. Right. And that's part of the story here.
In your research and travels, were there a couple of key modernist buildings that kind of set the stage for what was going to come later, that really elevated modernism and had people say, I want that?
I mean, for Houston, the obvious one is the Menil House, and that's designed by Philip Johnson for these art collectors who are really important for the Medicis of Houston, you might say. Really, after World War II, decided how modernism was going to be done in Texas, or in Houston at least. And it's a flat-roofed Miesian house, and it was finished in 1952. And then a whole cadre of architects in Houston fell under the sway of that particular kind of modern architecture because it was associated with these very important people in Houston. And then they got Mies van der Rohe to actually come to Houston and design an addition to the Museum of Fine Arts, and that reinforced this as the most kind of prestige architecture, much to the chagrin of the Frank Lloyd Wright disciples who felt slighted. And then, in between, there was what I like to call contemporary architecture, which is kind of everything else. But that was a real good example of a really critical building that changed the trajectory of modern architecture in Houston for at least a generation or two, and continues to have reverberations. They restored the Menil House in 2004 and did rehabilitation to it, and opened everyone's eyes to all how wonderful that house was all over again. So we continue to talk about it. And then the Menils also commissioned the Menil Collection building, which is Renzo Piano, one of his best works of architecture.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So it had a huge reach, what they did in the campus design for University of St. Thomas, and they did the Rothko Chapel, and all these things came about, after they did that house.
But I think it's important to emphasize that again, there are huge differences in these different cities, right? Like the San Antonio story is very different from the Houston story in that that's a place that was really dominated by O'Neill Ford and his influence. And he was someone who was thinking about climate and heat mitigation from early on. And his works, both at the Trinity University campus and many houses in San Antonio and South Texas, helped establish a kind of approach, and in some cases, a iconography, a kind of visual vocabulary for many other architects who's trained with him or were influenced by him. And then Dallas is its own separate thing, of course. Yeah.
Dallas is always its own separate thing, right?
I mean, they've got Kahn and Rudolph.
Right,
and, yeah.
all that. And then there's Marfa. So where do we put Marfa in this whole space? Such an unusual location. So for people that don't know what Marfa is, tell them about it.
Marfa, I would like to point out, was funded with Benil money. Donald Judd is a famous abstract land art installation artist in the 1960s and 70s, and got money from the Dio Foundation, which was founded by one of the Benil children. When she used her inheritance to do that. It's an art museum in New York City that sponsored land art projects. And he basically used a lot of the money to buy a whole bunch of properties and an abandoned U.S. Army fort and all sorts of other buildings in Marfa, and start over the course of 20, 30 years, make it into a gigantic modern art museum. That's the way I see it, with all these permanent installations in old Army barracks buildings in the center of the town and everywhere in between. And it's a really fascinating place that's turned into a art mecca now.
Yes. You make the pilgrimage to Marfa.
Yes. It remains difficult to get to, but you go there and you see people from all over the world walking around. It's kind of crazy.
Another place that most Americans have been to or will go through at some point in their lives is the enormous DFW airport. That was considered to be very modern when it was built, right?
Absolutely.
What was the story behind that?
I believe the story behind that was, of course, about making more money for the airlines and putting an airport between Dallas and Fort Worth to attract, of course, yet more money. And as probably many people know and may not like at all, right? It's almost like a miniature city, right? You have to get on these trains that run you around, and it's truly vast and sprawling and like a kind of mini urban complex unto itself.
I've been there, of course, a couple of hundred times. It seems to me, and this is no offense to Dallas, that it hasn't held up that well as kind of an icon of modernity, when at the time it was portrayed that way.
When it was built, it was, honestly, I blame the FAA and all of their regulations ever since the 9/11 attacks, when the government decided they hated airports and really started just wrecking them with all the security apparatus that they've installed everywhere. The same thing happened in Houston. Houston had a really great modern airport, and you can kind of see bits and pieces of it, but it's all covered up now with all this junk that they put in to make it so people can't do things they shouldn't be doing, or at least that the government doesn't do in the airport. So the DFW airport, when it was first built, was like a modern icon, and the regulations have changed so much that the building, unfortunately, was inflexible and not suited to the way that security requirements are determined now. So the building becomes compromised as a result. But it's policy that made that happen, not the building itself. The building's almost like a victim in this whole thing.
And Hobby Airport in Houston is the original building is a great Art Deco building that has been turned into a museum. And so that's sort of a nice little airport history moment in Texas.
Yeah.
Right, and that's still functioning, right? Hobby's still going.
Yes, you don't fly out of that particular building if you're getting on an airplane, but you can go and see it on your way to get on Southwest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's wrap up with the place that I understand you all spent a lovely afternoon, the Bass House in Fort Worth by Paul Rudolph. What was that like?
Amazing. It's one of the real icons of architecture, not just in Texas, but like the whole country. It's stunning. And it's painful to have to just talk about it and not have images of it. But we weren't allowed to photograph it when we were there, but they gave us a beautiful tour of it. And we spent, it was magical.
It really was. And something that maybe not everyone knows is the grounds are an important part of it. And so we got to see the gardens and really understand it as part of this landscape. And it's one of the very best examples, of course, of sort of enlightened patronage in the arts at a very, very high level, right? That the Bass family, of course, commissioned Rudolph for other projects as well. But the vision there with her art collection, especially, and a sort of understanding of what the power of section can do and these amazing views was really neat to see.
Did you get to meet Mrs. Bass, or was this her children?
This was her staff.
Her staff. So what's happening to the house now?
My understanding is that the children own it and do whatever they do with it.
Okay. Yeah. But it is being preserved. It's not in any danger of going away, I hope.
As far as I know, it isn't. I don't know what their plans are for it. However, it would be wonderful to have it listed on the National Register and maybe somewhat more accessible to architectural audiences, because it really is very special.
She maintained it with a full staff of 3 people in the house and a couple gardeners in case she wanted to come visit the house, but she didn't live in Texas anymore. She came back every once in a while, but she could have come back and everything is always perfectly set. All the beds are made, the refrigerator's food in it, it's all ready to go. And they would constantly keep maintaining it in that status for decades.
If you want to see the Bass House and other houses by Paul Rudolph, you can go to usmodernist.org/Rudolph. The book is Home, Heat, Money, God, Texas and Modern Architecture. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Michael Webb grew up in London and worked at the Times, Country Life, and the American Film Institute before becoming a prolific author with over 30 books on architecture and design. His newest, California Houses, features 36 unique California modernist homes that will truly wow you. And Michael lives what he preaches, residing in a Richard Neutra apartment once occupied by the great Charles and Ray Eames. George caught up with Michael on Zoom.
Michael, before we talk about your book, tell our listeners where you live, because it's a pretty special place and you've been there a long time.
I live in the Richard Neutra apartment that Charles and Ray Eames called home and workplace all the way through the 1940s. They moved out to LA after they married in 1941 and moved out on Christmas Eve 1949 for their classic house in the Pacific Palisades. And they found it an incredibly creative place to work, to conceive ideas when they went to their studio in Venice. And I've found it to be the most perfect place to live since I moved in 1978, which is now, 46 years.
Yeah.
And they'll have to carry me out. I should mention that it's 64 steps up from the street. So at some point, I'm probably going to have to, I'm quite sure how I'm going to get in and out, but right now it provides me with daily exercise. And for that, I'm grateful. And of course, removes me from the noise and pollution of the street. And it's a perfect apartment with light coming in all the way around, ribbon windows, a deck where I can eat outside and read outside for much of the year.
And does the Neutra family still own those?
No, Richard Neutra built it on spec with a landowner who shared the property, which saved it from demolition in the 1960s when UCLA were expanding and before Neutra became a household name. And it's on a very steep slope. Just to take one half would have required retaining walls that would have been hugely expensive to do. Wouldn't have made sense. So Neutra and then his son Dion, who died a few years ago, owned one half, and somebody else, the landowner and then his successor, owned the other half. And in fact, half of it is now condos, and the other half is still rental.
And I understand that Orson Welles lived there at one time.
So it is reputed. He was having an affair with Dolores Del Rio and wanted a place to hide away. And the first occupant of my apartment was Luise Rehner, the German actress who had won Best Actress Oscar, 2 Best Actress Oscars back to back. And she was divorcing Clifford Odets and wanted a place to hide from her fans. So both Orson Welles and she found this a very kind of a retreat from the world.
And your new book, California Houses, Creativity and Context, is this book like 31 or 32? Because you've done a lot of them before.
I think it's 30 that I've done, as it were, for myself, and probably another 30 that I've edited or contributed to or written the text for, mostly monographs. And that's spread over nearly 60 years. So, it's about one a year on average. It varies though from one year to another.
And how did you go about choosing the 36 houses in the book?
Some of them I knew already. Others were by favorite architects, and I'd call and say, what do you have? And they would show me their latest California houses. And others were architects I'd not met or talked to before, but were referred to me, and particularly in San Francisco. So many of the most acclaimed houses, modern houses of the last century, have been built in and around Los Angeles. And San Francisco has traditionally been a much more conservative place. And indeed, it's very hard to build anything that's different in the city of San Francisco. So I knew a few architects there, Stanley Seidowitz and Jim Jennings, and asked them for introductions to younger architects, and Fougeron, a wonderful French architect who was based there. And then I found 2 or 3 architects who were doing really good work, both in the city, but also in Northern California, in Mendocino and Napa counties.
Did you run into Woods and Dangaron in Los Angeles?
Yeah, I did a monograph with them a couple of years ago. But, it was hard because there are so many really talented architects in California, and one has to make very hard choices. And since I'd just written the whole book about the work of Woods and Dangaron, I decided to give other people a chance.
Yes, a chance. Right. So the book is about mostly new houses.
It's about houses built over the last 10 years, all of which are sustainable, although that's pretty much become a mandate for anything built in California now. But I wanted to pick houses that really captured the spirit of place. I mean, the great thing about California is it's almost like a continent in itself, isn't it? With beaches and 900 miles of coastline, snow-capped mountains, deserts, forests, big cities. And each of these provides a different context for building. And it's sad that builders don't get that. Builders grind out the same cookie-cutter designs from coast to coast, from Eureka to San Diego, regardless of where they're located. I wanted houses that really embraced the landscape, reached out to nature, took advantage of the climate. If it was a hot climate like Palm Springs, to provide protection from the heat and shade. If it was a cool, wet climate, as in the Northwest, to, again, relate to that and take full advantage of it. And to be something that wasn't mimicking the neighbors. There are certain areas like Santa Barbara and indeed San Francisco where everybody feels impelled to do the same thing over and over again, even though both are fairly recent cities. I mean, Santa Barbara was rebuilt after the earthquake in 1925 and San Francisco after the Great Fire in 1906. So neither, by European standards, is an old city, and yet they pretend to be an old city. They pretend that they have a heritage which is very largely new and invented. So I was looking for architects and work that would be fresh and yet rooted in place and in the past, so that the unchanging values of living, a place to live, would be carried forward. It wasn't just an exercise in geometry or a house that bragged about its wealth, but rather that enriched the lives of the people who lived there.
You mentioned earlier about sustainability. What are architects doing with houses in the last 10 years that they didn't do 20 years ago?
Well, I think a few architects, even back then, like David Hertz, understood the importance of having a house that was as frugal with energy, both in construction and in maintenance, as it possibly could be. And now I think virtually every responsible architect feels that way. And the mandates are very, very tight. As you know, in California, everything has to be as energy efficient as it possibly can be. And the rules are getting tighter and tighter, along with the seismic requirements and other issues. Some people feel that California is the most overregulated state in the union. But in fact, that's a challenge to architects to work within the rules and still produce something that is expressive and original. And best of them do that. They turn the constraints to advantage. They use all of the techniques, passive strategies of shade, of overhanging roof planes, of solar and photovoltaic panels, of geothermal. And all of these in combination allow even a house as large as the Hill House, which is a huge house, to be net zero. It uses no energy at all for heating or cooling, and it's embedded in the earth. So the earth provides natural insulation, and the openings on each side provide natural ventilation. And since it's very close to the ocean, it gets ocean breezes coming through most of the time, and also cooler winds coming off the mountains. So it's a model of how you can build even quite a large and extravagant house and still achieve a very high level of sustainability.
In the last 100 years, prefab has really been the holy grail of residential architecture. Have you discovered anybody that's making it work?
Well, like the Holy Grail, it's one of those things that's nice to imagine having, but nobody has found it. The problem with prefabrication, and as you say, it's been a preoccupation of architects for 100 years, is you've got to do it at scale. The only prefab housing that's done at scale are trailers, RV vehicles. Those can be churned out from a factory in the same way a car or truck is. So it brings the cost way down. And then all you have to do is hook it up to electricity and water. The problem is there's a stigma attached to trailer parks. Most people who can afford it don't want to live there or take advantage of that. And of course, there are issues of insulation. If you've got basically a tin box, unless there's an awning over it, you're probably not going to be very energy efficient. There are two factors. One is that you need a lot of land in order to build a large number of houses. Builders are totally against the idea of prefabrication because it's going to put their people out of work. They do it the old-fashioned way, by hand. There is some degree of prefabrication in the different pieces that go into the building, but often it takes a year or two to build quite an ordinary house. And it's messy, and it's done the way it was done 100 years ago. So, of course, it would be better to do it in a factory. So many people from Bucky Fuller and the Eames have pointed the way to doing a house that doesn't look like a prefab, but in fact, it can be made in a factory. And there are a couple of houses in the book, one up in Mendocino, in a very remote area, where they trucked in 6 or 8 modules, lowered them by crane, bolted them together, and it looks like any timber house that you would find in that area. And that can be done, but it's very little cost saving until you do it in a very large quantity.
In Austin, Texas, Icon and Lennar have created the first 3D printed neighborhood. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you found any 3D printed houses in California.
I didn't. From what I hear, it's still very much an experiment, and it's also, it can be wasteful because, you're dealing with concrete, which is not a good material when it comes to sustainability. I was reading today, so like 8% of air pollution is caused by concrete, by the making of, the use of concrete. Although in some countries, it's the primary building material. I don't think serious architects are using this except on an experimental basis, really just testing out the idea. Eventually, it may be the answer, but what I've seen looks pretty uninspiring.
In Los Angeles and several other places, there's been a movement towards accessory dwelling units, ADUs.
Yes.
Are you finding any creative architects building these smaller structures in people's backyards?
Yes, there was an initiative sponsored by the city, by Christopher Hawthorne, who was briefly design director of Los Angeles, to pre-approve certain designs, because one of the problems of building anything in LA is the sclerotic bureaucracy of the planning department, who take forever to approve. And if it's something that's original, they want it lab tested, and it adds enormously to the cost and the time taken. So Chrysler had this idea of inviting architects to submit designs that would be pre-approved. So anybody who wanted to put one in his or her backyard or anywhere else would automatically get a quick okay and not have to provide the mandatory 2 parking spaces, which again put a brake on development. And the idea was this would increase the housing stock. It's more likely, I think, to increase the number of dance studios, home offices, place to park Granny when she comes to stay. But it theoretically could add to the number of rental units, which LA badly needs. And there were some very interesting designs, most of them pretty modest, as you would imagine. But the one that really caught my imagination, which is featured in the book, is a tensile structure that Kevin Daly did with his students at UCLA back in 2015, where he essentially created this enlargeable structure of printed polystyrene that would be stretched taut, double layer, to provide insulation, very stretched taut over a lightweight aluminum frame that could be assembled by 2 people in a day, resting on a wooden platform. So it was both easily demountable, transportable, and it provided a shelter at very, very modest cost, again, if it could be produced in quantity. This was a mock-up, a prototype using shrink wrap, so of course, it cost very little, but it could be easily marketed for around $30,000 and extended to as much as 900 square feet with divisions and a solid area around the bathroom and light coming in from all sides, but printed to provide some privacy. And of course, if it were in a garden, a private enclave, the privacy issue wouldn't be as extreme. So that, I thought, was the most creative idea for an ADU. But of course, there are infinite number of possibilities.
The book is California Houses, Creativity and Context. Thanks for talking with me, Michael.
Thank you very much, George.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 22,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Shelby Hockenberry. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I'll be back soon with another Red State, Blue State edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.